The SS United States, America's flagship, the fastest and safest ocean liner in history and a classified military service ship in the event of war. Winner of the Blue Riband and one of the last remaining classic ocean liners left in the world. She sits, quiet and dormant, at Pier 82 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a reminder of the triumph of the transatlantic passenger service and waiting in hope for an eventual second life. Whatever may come of her, this ship has stories to tell us. Thanks to the wonderful assistance of the SS United States Conservancy, my friends and I have been given access to the ship so we could come aboard, explore her history, uncovering it as we go below decks, and find parts of the ship never before seen online.
This is all original.
Yep.
We'll take a step back into the 1950s and 60s, with this magnificent ship serving as our window to the past. The idea for the SS United States was born out of the imagination of designer William Francis Gibbs, who even at a young age dreamed of building America's first 1,000-foot ocean liner. The U.S. Shipping Board approved the construction of two liners in 1916 that may have surpassed 1,000 feet, but the construction was canceled as America came closer and closer to entering the First World War. When war initially broke out in Europe in 1914, the German liner Vaterland had just arrived in New York City and chose not to return to Europe out of fear of being attacked by the British Navy. The ship sat there until 1917 when the United States declared war on Germany, and the German liner was promptly seized and put into service as a troop ship. When the war ended, the ship was kept as compensation for American ships sunk by Germany. The International Mercantile Marine managed the conversion of the German liner and troop transport into a post-war modern American superliner, and William Francis Gibbs oversaw the design while his brother Frederick handled the business end. In 1922, the ship was brought to Newport News Shipbuilding near Norfolk, Virginia, for a 14-month overhaul. Gibbs Brothers stripped the ship clean, removing everything from the furnishings down to the wires, even more bare than the SS United States is today, redesigning her from the ground up, until a nearly completely different vessel emerged. Out of their shipyard steamed the SS Leviathan, former Vaterland, the first major contract of the Gibbs Brothers. The Leviathan entered service for the United States lines as one of the fastest and largest ships of the day, although of course Cunard and White Star Line would get very angry if they heard anyone say that. The Gibbs brothers partnered with yacht designer Daniel Cox in 1929 to form Gibbs and Cox. They went on to design several other liners, including the SS America for the United States lines, launched in 1940. The SS America was primarily underwritten by the US government under the condition that the ship would become a troop carrier in the event of war, especially as World War II had already begun in Europe by this point. As the United States remained neutral, the SS America continued crossing the Atlantic as a neutral vessel, even having painted a large American flag on either side of her hull to show her neutrality. In December 1941, America finally entered the war in both Europe and the Pacific theaters. While the SS America would become a troop ship, Gibbs and Cox put its design efforts into hundreds of military and merchant vessels for the war effort, including the famous Liberty ships and LSTs. It was said that nearly 75% of American shipping during the Second World War had the Gibbs and Cox stamp somewhere on board, with these vessels greatly contributing to America's victory. The end of World War II didn't bring about quite the same ocean liner renaissance that the First War did, but William Francis Gibbs still hadn't given up on his youthful dream of designing a 1,000-foot superliner. Two stars aligned for Gibbs that led to the realization of his lifelong dream. First, United States Lines was now seeking to replace some of their outdated liners with a larger, streamlined vessel, and they wanted Gibbs to design it for them. At the same time, the Soviet Union was becoming more of a threat to the United States. While the Americans and the British returned European lands that they liberated during the war back to sovereign rule, the Soviet Union kept them as their own conquered territories. It was evident that the Soviet Union wanted to capture Europe entirely, and America and Britain were all that really stood in their way. The United States needed a transport that could deliver a full Army division of 14,000 troops across the Atlantic or the Pacific as quickly as possible. Gibbs brought his superliner plans for the United States lines to the U.S. government to seek a subsidy, emphasizing the ship's use as a troop or hospital ship as needed. They approved the plans, subsidizing nearly 2/3 of the $78 million needed to build the ship. It was to be built to strict Navy standards, but even stricter Gibbs standards. Gibbs was paranoid about the damage a fire would have on an ocean liner, being painfully aware of the Morro Castle disaster off the New Jersey coast in 1934 and the Pier side Normandy burning in 1942. Gibbs insisted on every single element of the ship being fireproof, and that included the Ballroom's piano. The Ballroom piano was a baby grand provided by Steinway, and when Gibbs ordered this piano, he requested that it be made from aluminum. Theodore Steinway was appalled by this request. The Hindenburg actually had an aluminum piano, but it just didn't have the rich sound of a wooden one. This ship was going to be entertaining the finest celebrities and dignitaries, and so it needed a proper mahogany piano, Steinway insisted. They argued back and forth until finally Steinway doused a wooden piano in gasoline and lit it on fire to prove to Gibbs that the flames would not spread. With that, Gibbs relented and allowed the pianos on board to be made of wood, one of the very few uses of wood on the entire ship.
William Francis Gibbs was a little so superstitious, so when you hear that phrase, touch wood, knock on wood, whatever, you couldn't do that aboard the SS United States because there was no wood to knock on unless you were near a piano or something. So Mr. Gibbs had a 6-inch wooden ruler in his top pocket, so if he had to knock on wood, it was there for him.
Fire mains with hoses were placed port and starboard at regular intervals throughout the ship, charged by diesel engine-powered pumps. Hundreds of CO2 canisters were rigged to suppress any fuel or electrical fires. The Navy required additional safety features, including further compartmentalization of her lower hull, even more than what was used for most passenger ships. Today we can still see many of the control wheels that could be used to close the 66 watertight doors below deck if the automated controls from the bridge failed. The ship also needed redundant engine rooms. If one engine room or its adjacent boiler room were disabled, the ship would still be able to function using her second one. On top of that, the ship's engines and power plant were near copies of the ones installed in the Forrestal class of aircraft carriers, incredibly powerful, and meant to move a massively heavy ship at high speeds. With the two engine rooms working together, the SS United States had an output of nearly 250,000 horsepower. That wasn't all. If built entirely of the usual steel, the SS United States would have had a displacement of around 55,000 long tons. However, all of her upper works were built of significantly lighter aluminum, reducing the ship to a mere 45,400 long tons.
Handrails like this would have been wood on other ocean liners. You can see it still on the Queen Mary. But on the SS United States, this is all aluminum.
She was the largest single construction of aluminum in history up to that time, a record which wasn't broken until the 1970s with the construction of the World Trade Center in New York. Her propulsion was the strongest on the sea, and she was unbelievably light for her size. Her enormous power-to-weight ratio was well over twice that of the Queen Mary or any other liner. The keel for hull number 488 was laid on February 8, 1950, inside a dry dock rather than on an angled slipway. This would enable the design features of the new ship to remain a secret from the press for as long as possible, being hidden away from outside viewers. While yes, Gibbs had always dreamed of building a 1,000-foot superliner, the length of this vessel was limited to 990 feet, so that it could fit into the Panama Canal. The ship's hull alone was made of over 180,000 prefabricated segments, assembled and welded together in the dry dock. Compare her 1-inch thick plating with the half-inch or thinner thickness plating on modern cruise ships like the ill-fated Costa Concordia. The streamlined funnels, with their distinctive horizontal fins, in order to deflect exhaust smoke away from the decks, were hoisted into place. At 65 feet, they were the largest funnels ever placed on a vessel, and then painted the old-fashioned American red, white, and blue. This was to be America's flagship, to be thoroughly patriotic through and through, featuring modern American-themed decor from the country's contemporary artists. Over 800 companies from every state of the Union would make a contribution to her. Her interior decor was designed almost exclusively by women, in a distinctly modern style, and all of the fabrics and furnishings had to meet the fireproof requirements. Instead of traditional teak decking, the United States decks were a fireproof composite green surface called Neotext, poured into place, hardened, and still there in places today nearly 75 years later. Everything about this ship was designed with safety in mind. We've heard of plenty of ships sinking without enough lifeboats for everyone on board, or in the case of the Lusitania, leaning so heavily that half of the lifeboats were unusable. Well, the United States had enough lifeboats and rafts for all on board twice over. The idea was that it could evacuate its full complement of passengers and crew using lifeboats and rafts from just one side, should the ship develop a significant list. 3,000 workers spent the next 12 months fitting her out, and her sea trials conducted in secrecy off the Virginia coast. She was unbelievably powerful, soaring through the seas at high speeds, speeds that would remain classified for years. In April 1978, John R. Kane, the former vice president of Newport News Shipbuilding, revealed that the top speed achieved during the sea trials was 38.32 knots, or roughly 44 miles per hour, developed at 160 RPM using almost 242,000 horsepower. Although rumors have persisted that the ship could manage 40 knots, or 46 miles per hour, this was beyond the capacity of even the SS United States' equipment. Once completed, the ship's builder's plaque was mounted on the forward end of the superstructure, still displayed proudly after all these years.
A ship that would be the First Lady of the Seas in peacetime and the greatest single naval auxiliary in time of national emergency.
Noon, July 3rd, 1952. Fittingly, the eve of Independence Day. The SS United States departed Pier 86 in Manhattan on her maiden voyage. Expectations were high. The pressure was on her captain, Commodore Harry Manning, to live up to these expectations. There had never been a ship like this before, so light for her size, so powerful, and so sleek. The responsibility of seeing this through couldn't have fallen on a better man for the job. Though he often clashed personalities with William Gibbs, Harry Manning was a stubborn and determined commander who was ready to drive this ship to its limits. Well, not exactly. The limits of the ship were still classified. Nonetheless, the ship soared past the Ambrose Light outside New York Harbor, and the clock was now ticking. The knife of the bow sliced through the Atlantic waves as passengers celebrated the 4th of July down below. There were a handful of celebrities on board, including comedian Bob Hope and Margaret Truman, daughter of then-President Harry Truman. The ship averaged a speed of about 40 miles per hour, slowing down only for a brief fog bank off the American coast. Now, fog wasn't as much of a danger to the United States as it was on earlier vessels thanks to the use of the most up-to-date radar systems, enabling her crew to see around them even in the thickest of fogs. She would be one of the first passenger ships equipped with it. Standing prominently above the bridge is the ship's radar mast. While the ship didn't have the same needs for the typical forward and main masts like classic liners, the mast was still needed for the radar, being mounted at the topmost platform. Now, being aboard the ship, I couldn't resist the opportunity to climb up it. Inside the mast, on deck level, are cubbies for signal flags, giving the crew easy access to any flags that they'd need to raise. This enclosed crow's nest was sheltered from the elements and heated, making watch duty an almost comfortable post. inside the crow's nest. I'm leaving my phone here, don't let me forget that.
Here, I'll put it in my pocket.
Up here was where the radar was mounted, now giving us a great view of the Delaware River, New Jersey, and IKEA, where my wife was expecting me to take her right after this. Wow. I can imagine the view looking down from this lofty post, where the rocking of the waves was most noticeable, and seeing the ocean racing past below. Commodore Manning wasn't just pushing the ship, he was pushing himself. He averaged 4 hours of sleep each night, and over the course of the round-trip maiden voyage, he'd lose 10 pounds from stress alone. But he stood his post most of the time, not being one for socializing with passengers, but he did allow for a late-night visit from Margaret Truman and her friends, allowing them to briefly even hold the ship's wheel. An interesting detail is that Commodore Manning was indeed a real Commodore. The role of captain of the SS United States also included the responsibilities of being Commodore of the whole United States Line fleet of more than 50 vessels. A big responsibility indeed. The ship was speeding along. So fast was she going that the water was blasting the paint off of her bow. Despite this, a passenger described her voyage as 99% vibration-free. Some staterooms near the propellers where vibrations could be felt were later reassigned to crew. The ship glided past Bishop's Rock Light, and the stopwatch clicked. The SS United States had crossed the Atlantic eastbound in 3 days, 10 hours, and 40 minutes, obliterating the standing 14-year record of the Queen Mary, beating it by over 10 hours. She stopped in Le Havre, France, before sailing on to Southampton, concluding the voyage, before retracing its journey, returning to New York. The return voyage smashed the westbound record as well, cleanly securing the Blue Riband. At the end of the voyage, crew who served in her engine room stated that the ship never surpassed 199,000 of its full 240,000 horsepower capability. This was the first time an American ship held the Blue Riband since the Collins liner Baltic in 1851. The Collins liner Pacific briefly held it before the Baltic, and the Baltic broke its own record again in 1854. Nearly a full century had passed since the Baltic lost the Blue Riband to the Cunard liner Persia. This time around, however, the SS United States' record was a mere third of the time that the Baltic took to cross the sea. The Blue Riband, for those of you who don't know, is an unofficial award given to a ship with the fastest Atlantic crossing time. In order to win the Blue Riband, a ship has to be carrying passengers and designed to stay on that transatlantic route for regularly scheduled passenger service.
Her owners were awarded the Hales Trophy, symbolic of the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic, and her crew paraded up Broadway for the traditional Hero's Homecoming. America took pride in her new ocean champion, the most modern, the most beautiful, the fastest passenger ship in the world, the SS United States.
This was momentous. The United States of America, the country that pioneered the use of steam for commercial shipping with John Fitch in 1787 and Robert Fulton and his North River steamboat in 1807, the country whose packet ships set the template that all scheduled Atlantic voyages would follow, and the country whose merchant marine kept the Allies alive during World War II, had now captured the most prestigious award in passenger shipping.
My grandfather sailed in 1959, and he was going to Italy.
But as a naturalized American, he was proud that the United States built the fastest ship in the world. So when it came time for him, after 30 years, to return home, instead of taking a ship to go to Italy, which normally he would have done, he actually sailed from New York to France, took a train to Italy, just so he could take the SS United States, and he did the same thing in return. And even as a kid growing up, but he would always quiz me, what's the fastest ship in the world? And I knew the answer was SS United States, probably at 4 years old.
With the record shattered, the champagne drank, the newsreels filmed, and the victory cigars smoked, it was time for the fastest superliner in history to settle into a routine. But what was routine like on such a vessel? Voyage number 1 saw the ship sailing from New York to Southampton, beating the Queen Mary's time by 10 hours, and then back home again with the eastbound Blue Riband secured. After a second round-trip crossing, voyage number 3 was to be like many other voyages after it. The ship sat at Pier 86 on the Hudson River, towering above the pier as every conceivable crew drill was conducted. Fire drills, abandoned ship drills, and lifeboat drills. Though, granted, they couldn't actually put lifeboats in the water because of the pier and the fuel barges, so the crew mimicked the motions. But regardless, the crew was to be kept in top shape, ready for any problem that may occur at sea. Typically, the ship would depart Friday at noon, but supplying the liner began early in the morning the day before, including bringing aboard cars, up to 43 of them per voyage, that would be transported across the ocean in the ship's cargo holds that were 9 stories deep. The ship also had a postal contract, carrying hundreds of sacks of international mail. Fuel barges would pump thousands of tons of fuel oil aboard, and the boilers would be fired up to make steam. Friday morning at 8:30 saw the first passengers arriving. Hundreds of cabs and cars and thousands of people bustled onto the pier. It may have looked like chaos, but it was indeed very organized and efficient, with porters directing passengers and handling baggage expertly. Passengers coming aboard always had plenty of luggage with them, and porters walking around with luggage sticker racks like this one would go around distributing the proper tags to the passengers throughout the ship. Each sticker had a letter on it, designating the baggage sorting station nearest to the cabin that the luggage belonged to, which would expedite the sorting once on board. The SS United States was so big that it required every letter of the alphabet for a sorting station. However, I believe certain letters, such as G, had a special meaning, and I think G meant general. There was a different design for the different classes on board, so that the luggage wouldn't get mixed up. With the baggage in the hands of the porters, the passengers were in the hands of the stewards, directing them through the ship and helping them find their staterooms. Navigating through the maze of corridors wasn't easy, especially if your steward was busy helping others, or if you were too proud to ask for help, but there were visual cues throughout the ship to help you. Many of these visual aids still exist today on the ship. There were the obvious aids, such as signage and plans that the ship had. On every landing and the staircase, the name of the deck was written, inset into the floor, since most people were looking down at their feet while walking in high seas. Then there were the more subtle aids. When walking through a passenger corridor, a floor pattern would tell you what class you were in. First-class corridors had large circles inset into the flooring, while the other classes had other symbols such as dashes in cabin class. The ship had many elevators for the convenience of her passengers and crew. Many of the elevator cabs still hang and are accessible. This would have been illuminated to indicate what floor the elevator was on. And if that elevator went out of service, which was rare, they had these little cards that they would stick on them, asking you to please use the elevator on the other side. As passengers found their cabins, they were often pleasantly surprised by Bon Voyage presents waiting for them in the cabins that their friends had ordered for them, a long-standing seagoing tradition. There were parties held in the ship's different lounges while people made their way on board. The parties were even open to non-passengers who were seeing off their friends.
And when this girl can open the champagne, it'll flow like water.
The commotion of boarding was interrupted at 11:30, a half hour prior to departure, with an announcement over the loudspeakers, calling for all ashore who were staying ashore. The ship's 2 pilots came aboard in the next few minutes to navigate the ship out of the harbor, and the tugboats Grace Moran and Doris Moran came up onto either side of the vessel. There was celebration, fanfare, and music as the gangways were pulled back for departure, with passengers lining the rails to throw streamers and wave to friends, family, and total strangers as the SS United States began backing out from the pier. The motion of the ship was hardly perceivable without the visual cues, as the ship barely heaved and began her trip without any significant vibration. Promptly, at noon, of course. Tugboats, dwarfed by the massive liner, assisted in getting the ship out into the main traffic lane of the Hudson River. Exactly 48 minutes after casting off, the ship passed the Statue of Liberty. At 2 hours past casting off, the ship had passed the Ambrose Lightship. Under an overcast sky, the fastest passenger liner afloat was now out in the open sea. Her cruising speed on this voyage would average around 32 knots, and the first afternoon was spent getting passengers prepared for any trouble that may unlikely come up, including a lifeboat drill at 4 p.m. as well as general alarms. With the passengers' work over, it was time to resume the entertainment and dining. The first-class dining room was down on A deck, practically dead center in the entire ship, the area intended to experience the least amount of rocking and rolling. The room was a cream color, with white tablecloths, red chairs, and a raised ceiling above the center of the room. A sculpture by the American artist Gwen Lux, titled Expressions of Freedom, hung on the bulkhead. It was made of foam glass. She wanted to make it out of plaster, which was more conventional, but not quite fireproof enough for Mr. Gibbs.
This famous gray star pattern is one of Pennsylvania's contributions to this great ship,
with the Mayer China Company of Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania supplying it.
It wasn't the exclusive supplier though, with Sterling China of Ohio also supplying batches of this china for the United States lines. This china was simple, sleek, and patriotic, but more importantly, it was durable. It could survive a bit of a beating without really cracking or chipping, and it was made to be dishwasher safe even at high temperatures. Surviving menus from the ship give us a unique glimpse into the dining on board. Now, fine dining is a staple on all major Atlantic liners, but the SS United States stood out.
Dining on board the United States was not exclusively American fare, but a sampling of global delicacies. Caviar from Iran, Scottish grouse, kangaroo tail soup, crepe Suzette, and of course, the famous thick American steaks.
The crew had their own design of china, manufactured primarily by a company named Hall. It was simple and patternless, but the mug is what interests me the most. It has a wide, flat bottom so that it can be sat down just about anywhere without worrying about it tipping over, and it's designed for maximum contact with the hands. The point of that is so that crewmen on deck could hold their coffee or tea in their hands and help keep them warm on a late night's watch in the middle of the cold North Atlantic.
We actually later found the dining room for tourist class, and you can see where the tables once were. Despite being the most affordable accommodation on the ship, the tourist class dining room was actually quite nice. On a clear day, there was plenty of recreation on the outdoor decks. Passengers could play deck tennis on the full tennis courts using rubber rings or quoits, or had the pick of the traditional shipboard staples. You could play shuffleboard, or try your hand at table tennis or ring toss. I can't help but wonder how many rings were lost overboard, particularly due to the wind created by the ship's speeding movement. The decks were mostly protected by windbreakers, but I imagine they weren't flawless. Look at that! They even had turtle races. Doesn't that look like fun? On the open decks, there was plenty of space to grab a deck chair and sun yourself. Back here, you would be sheltered from the wind that the ship was producing, for the most part, and could grab a book, chat with your friends, or enjoy light fare served by the stewards. The steward department alone on the SS United States boasted a nearly 800-person crew. If a first-class or cabin-class passenger wanted to swim, they could go for a dip in the ship's swimming pool. It was not just your typical plunge bath as we see on the earlier liners of the previous generation. This was a proper swimming pool. Come on in, the water's fine. That's not just me being cheesy, the signal flags on the wall actually say that. The swimming pool was deep inside the ship on sea deck. So deep in the ship, in fact, that the pool itself was situated between the ship's propeller shafts. Even just navigating the corridors and stairways down into the ship to find the pool was an adventure. Outboard of the swimming pool were changing rooms and massage parlors. With everything this ship has to offer, there's never a dull moment aboard the SS United States. With all that excitement and exercise, fine dining and socializing, you're going to go back to your cabin each night and sleep like a rock. After the steward has turned the room over for the evening and lowering any bunks from the wall for the kids, it's time to retire. Just look at this amazing snack tray that stewards bring in for the passengers as they're getting ready for bed. Sandwiches, fruits, skewers. This guy's enjoying it. He's enjoying it a lot, actually. Today, the blocks of hundreds of cabins of all three classes have been stripped, leaving only their outlines on the steel floor. Every threshold you see here is the entrance to another cabin. So each one of these blocks is a cabin of its own. The threshold's missing here, but this would have been an entryway. And then another cabin. And then another cabin right here. There is nothing that remains of these cabins except the outline on the floor. Going into this cabin right here, which would have been a first-class cabin, we would have a toilet and a shower right here. The plumbing still hangs from the ceiling on this shower. This most likely would have been a closet. And then here would be the main bedroom area and sitting room. You can even see the remains of where some of the furniture would have been. We likely would have had some sort of a dresser along there. And the bed would have been right here. There probably would have been an additional bed right underneath the windows. And two portholes in this one, looking right out onto the sea. The cabins were comfortable, with those in first and cabin class staterooms having their own toilet, tub, or shower, with full-length mirrors. Tourist class passengers used shared toilets, baths, and shower rooms. But there was also modern air conditioning throughout the ship and temperature control in each stateroom or cabin. On the subject of cabins, this blanket is marked cabin C55, and that's precisely the cabin that we're looking at here. Or at least this is where that cabin was. This tourist class cabin was small but comfortable, and deep down on one of the lowest decks in the bow. The ship's bridge. It's from here, towering 100 feet above the waterline, that Commodore Manning captained the United States on her illustrious first crossing. He was still in command of the United States on this voyage and conducted routine tests of all ship functions on a daily basis from his post on the bridge. The bridge of the ship was state-of-the-art, featuring the helm, engine telegraphs, and compasses. The machinery now is long gone, but the footprints of the bridge equipment give us a glimpse at what this space once was. When the captain wasn't making his rounds or socializing with the passengers, he was most often on the bridge or in the area immediately around it. Immediately after the bridge was the damage control room, and the chart room, where the radar consoles stood. From here, the charts and maps would be consulted and the ship's course planned out. Work in the room ensured that the United States navigated safely through the waters of the world. Beneath the bridge was the officers' quarters, with the captain's cabin fitted to the curve of the forward end of the superstructure. His and the rest of the officers' quarters were spacious, practical but plain, design typical of a ship in the merchant marine of the time. The captain even had his own reception room and pantry adjacent to his cabin along the ship's center line. Through the forward portholes, the captain could look out over the forecastle and watch where the ship was heading, even when he was in his personal quarters. From there, he would be able to observe any waves breaking over the bow of the ship, and on the next, the fourth round-trip voyage, that's precisely what he saw. The ship was met with winds measuring gale force 8, or roughly 45 miles per hour, as the remnants of Hurricane Baker worked its way past New England. Well, this wasn't a problem for the ship, but it did mean slowing down a bit until the storm passed, then making up for the time with a burst of speed, pitching at most 6 degrees to either side. Noticeable for the passengers, yes, but not enough to cause serious discomfort. The ship eased gracefully into each roll. Like any North Atlantic liner, rolling was something that the SS United States had a tendency of doing, if the late fall and winter seas were too bad. During a 70-mile-per-hour gale in December 1953, it was recorded as rolling 25 degrees to port and starboard. Funny enough, rolling is nearly inevitable, no matter how often a designer thinks it won't be. When the RMS Queen Mary was completed in 1936, it was believed that she was too big to roll.
It's interesting to think that on the maiden voyage, Queen Mary didn't have the handrails along the side because they thought that the ship would be so steady that she wouldn't need it. But she ended up being quite a roller. So handrails were quickly installed.
The United States had similar handrails, allowing passengers who hadn't yet gotten their sea legs to move throughout the ship with ease. In rough seas, they'd actually clip a stanchion into this. Connects to a cross here. People could hold on to it in rough weather. The wind was cold and biting, and the sea spray broke over the bow. It was definitely a day that was spent indoors. No worries, of course. The United States had plenty to offer on a day like this. If you still wanted to stroll the decks, the enclosed promenade offered protection from the elements while still giving plenty of walking space in fresh air. The promenade was heated and stocked with plenty of deck chairs, with its own special steward's service. It stretched from the main staircase aft and looped around the large first and cabin class theater. There was an additional, smaller enclosed promenade a deck below. The main enclosed promenade, however, offers excellent access to most of the ship's premier public spaces. We're inside one of the ship's 2 theaters, both of which are located on the promenade deck. Like the swimming pool, this 350-seat theater was shared by first-class and cabin-class passengers. The stage at the aft end is still standing. This is where the second baby grand piano was located. Not only could live performances have been made on the stage, but a projection screen could be lowered and show films, both classic and new Hollywood releases. On our voyage, the ship's 3rd round-trip crossing, it's a good bet that the brand new movie Singing in the Rain was shown. Later on, wide CinemaScope screens were added to both theaters. The other theater was forward and reserved for tourist-class passengers. Smaller, but still comfortable. Forward of the first-class theater is the smoking room, a place to relax and smoke with friends. It was decorated in warm autumn hues with a map of the world on the aft panel, inset with clocks showing the different time zones.
And inside the smoke room, you're bound to find the typical staples of a men's lounge. Everything from playing cards, like we have here in this complete souvenir set from the SS United States, featuring the ship in both night and day scenes, matchbooks to light your cigars, cigarettes, or pipes with, and an ashtray for when you've finished with it.
Close by was the gift shop and the tobacco shop.
As with all ships, postcards were readily available in the gift shop or anywhere on the ship for passengers to purchase and send off the ship to their friends and loved ones back home. Souvenir tins like this were also available, and you could find candies inside, manufactured by Benson's Confectionery of England.
The observation lounge towards the front of the promenade deck still shows signs of its former glory, with the metal archways and sweeping windows. This area also featured a library and a writing room. The ship had playrooms for the children, with attendants on duty to keep them safe and having fun while Mom and Dad were enjoying what the ship had to offer. In this cabin-class playroom, we see tables that were built into the ship's posts. Otherwise, nothing more than the floor tiling and floor outline remain of this once happy place. While we're in cabin class, let's take a quick look aft the playroom, where we'd find the cabin-class lounge, complete with a stage at the aft end. In this same spot, one deck below, the cabin-class smoke room. The bar on the aft end is still in place. On the fourth afternoon, a British observation plane spotted the inbound liner and tipped its wings as a salute. Less than 3 hours later, Bishop Rock was sighted off the port bow as the sun set behind the vessel. Another speedy voyage was coming to an end. The final night at sea is always a huge celebration, and the very heart of the ship's social life was in the ballroom. A central dome was the very center of it, rising high above the dance floor. Carved glass scenes of sea life and lit panels provide the backdrop as a Meyer Davis orchestra plays the night away. Professional dancers got the evening started, and magicians performed between acts, keeping the evening fun for the whole family. Drinks on the United States were only about a third of the price that they were on land, as there was no liquor tax charged on board. The ballroom today looks a bit different. The outline of the dance floor remains, and the casing for the central dome rises empty above. You'll notice a bar in the ballroom today, and it does sit about where the ship's bar was, but this is not original to the ship. It's a fabrication that was brought here a few years back for a film that was shot on board. We're in the ballroom right now, and this mechanism right here is what was able to dim the lights in here as people were dancing. A few steps away from the ballroom was a cocktail room known as the Navajo Lounge, celebrating the culture of the Navajo Indians and decorated in traditional sand paintings. Looking at this space, I'm particularly reminded of the train the Santa Fe Super Chief, a contemporary of the SS United States that was also decorated in Southwest motifs, melded with the modernist fashions of the 1950s. Breakfast was served the following morning at 7:30 a.m. as the ship pulled into Le Havre, just in time for those disembarking to catch the 9 a.m. boat train to Paris. Many of the passengers would get off here in France to travel across mainland Europe, while the rest proceeded on to England. The harbor of Le Havre was damaged terribly during the Second World War and is a testament to France's ability to bounce back. Only 7 years later, it was a fully functional tourist port, taking in the fastest and one of the grandest liners afloat. By lunchtime, the ship was already back at sea and steaming across the English Channel. First-class passengers lined up in the smoking lounge to be processed by British immigration officials. The ship made its way across the channel and in towards the city of Southampton, passing the RMS Queen Elizabeth along the way. At 7:02 p.m., the SS United States was tied to the dock and readying to disembark. The ship was turned around in only 17 hours, leaving Britain behind, stopping in France and making its way home. With enough fuel capacity to travel for 10,000 miles across the Pacific and back, there was no need to refuel with the expensive European oil. On one of its early returning voyages, the United States came upon the Queen Elizabeth bound for New York. While both Cunard and the United States lines denied it, some have claimed that the two ships unofficially raced each other. With ease, though, the SS United States quickly overcame the Elizabeth, blasting its horn in a salute as it did so. On August 21st, the SS United States had completed its third round-trip voyage. The press still couldn't get their fill of the technological feat that was this liner, with some journalists and photographers coming aboard alongside immigration officials before the ship entered the harbor. She was the personal favorite of scores of celebrities, with countless having sailed aboard her, including Cary Grant, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, Walt Disney, Duke Ellington, and silent film star and a regular on my channel, Buster Keaton. The ship received some criticism, however. In addition to being prone to rolling, the foremost critique was that the excessive fireproofing of the ship made her interiors dull and diminished the luxury of traveling on board. We don't hear too much about the rest of the SS United States' career, as it was fairly uneventful. There were a few stowaways, smugglers caught, babies born on board, and at-sea rescues, but there were no groundings or collisions, fires, or other significant tragedies. Seriously, there wasn't much to say about a smoothly operating ship that already smashed every speed record.
During her 16-year career, she never suffered a mechanical breakdown or failure. Everything was, top-notch, the best engineers.
The worst that seems to have happened was she encountered more storms and smashed more dishes. Interestingly, although designed to be easily converted into a troop ship, the SS United States avoided any Korean War service from 1950 to 1953, although many other passenger ships were drafted for the war effort. The ship was a success well through the 1950s, regularly sailing with more than 90% capacity booked on board, sailing alongside her running mate, the older SS America. One small event of note, however, concerns a celebrity crewman named Claude Jones, a trombonist who played alongside Duke Ellington in his early days. After giving up the music scene, Claude decided to sign up as a steward aboard the SS United States in the late 1950s and into the 60s. He wanted to see the world and fell in love with the refined life of a liner at sea. A surprise came in January 1960 when Claude waited on his old friend, Mr. Ellington, while the ship was underway. Claude kept his old trombone on the ship with him, chatting up about his life with anyone interested, and was even collaborating on an autobiography with a regular passenger when in January 1962 Claude fell ill and died aboard the SS United States. The SS United States was the top liner of its day, but the very same year as her first voyage, the seeds had been sown for her eventual downfall. The first jet-propelled airliner, the de Havilland Comet, entered service with its first paying passengers on European flights, and would soon begin transatlantic passenger service 3 weeks later. In October 1958, Pan American Airways inaugurated its Boeing 707 daily service from New York to Paris. No matter how fast the superliner United States was, it could never beat the 6-hour flight time of an airliner. The days of regular ocean liner travel were numbered. As travel diminished, some of the winter transatlantic crossings were replaced with Bermuda, Caribbean, and South American cruises. Her running mate, the SS America, was retired in 1963 and eventually sold off to a Greek shipping line, and the SS United States had a new running mate, the SS France. In 1967, the Cunard liner Queen Mary was retired, and the Queen Elizabeth retired the following year. 1969 saw the beginning and end of an era. Cunard brought out the Queen Elizabeth II. The Boeing 747 was introduced, and the first Apollo moon landing was made. The SS United States was one of the last superliners on the Atlantic when a month-long Pacific cruise was announced for January 1970. Tickets were selling out, but the plug was pulled. After making its annual run to Newport News for maintenance and refitting, the trip was canceled. But an even graver announcement was made. The SS United States would be pulled from service after a robust 17-year career, having completed exactly 400 voyages. She was laid up in Norfolk, Virginia, and sealed like a time capsule until something was to be done with her. Inside the closed-off vessel, the dishes were still on their shelves, the furniture in place, and crew uniforms still on the coat hangers. In the meantime, the United States Lines had completely given up ownership and handed her over to the U.S. government. Norwegian Caribbean Cruise Line sought to purchase her as a cruise ship in 1976, but the government denied the sale, given the classified status of the ship. Instead, Norwegian bought the SS France, converting it for cruise trade, and renamed it the Norway. The SS United States was declassified a year later and purchased in 1980 by a developer who also hoped to sail the ship as a cruise liner. This plan financially crumbled, and in 1984 the time capsule was opened up and everything inside her sold off at auction and scattered. Much of her accoutrements went to private collectors, while many artifacts ended up in the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. At the National Museum of American History, part of the Smithsonian, a concave wall panel from the first-class observation lounge titled The Currents is on display, having been sold off during that auction. The ship was sold off again to a Turkish company who towed the ship to Sevastopol in the Ukraine to remove the asbestos on board. It was stripped down to the bare bulkheads, and most of what remained of the interiors were trashed. The aluminum lifeboats and their davits were removed to pay off part of the debt that had been incurred. It was later towed back to Philadelphia and ultimately purchased by Norwegian in 2003 with the hope of putting her back to service. While the SS France, or now the Norway, had gone to the scrapyard, the United States was finally rescued from scrap by the SS United States Conservancy in 2011. The Conservancy has graciously allowed us to come aboard and explore the liner, helping to share the ship's stories with the world. While we're here, let's take a look under the hood of this ship, venturing down into the engine room to see what remains of that immensely powerful machinery that broke the speed records. We squeezed through the narrow catwalks between the massive machinery inside the very bottom of the ship, about 20 feet below the waterline. It's completely black in here, with the exception of our flashlights. Of the 3 engineering compartments that we explored, we're starting in the forwardmost, or the one closest to the front of the ship. Granted, we are still a long way from the front of the ship, as we're only exploring the aft engineering spaces. Remember, the ship had 2 independent power plants, and this is the second one. We begin in the after boiler room, which contained 4 of the ship's 8 boilers. They're massive, each the size of a townhouse. You can't get an appreciation for their size. As if we're exploring some deep cave, we only see what's immediately in front of us, illuminated by our lights, while the rest of these monsters fade off into the darkness, masked further by a web of pipes, valves, and other machinery. The spaces between the boilers allowed the crew to work, with much of their equipment still left where it was last used. Handwritten notes by the crew who last stood watch by these boilers, written on a ship menu from 1967. A phone for calling other positions on the ship. That bell had to be shrill, otherwise you wouldn't hear it over the noise of the machines. The ship would operate on only 6 of its 8 boilers, allowing maintenance to be done on the idle boilers while underway. Outboard in this boiler room are propeller shafts. Now don't let that confuse you. The boilers in this room have nothing to do with those propeller shafts. The shafts that we see here are powered by the forward engine room, making their way aft through here toward the ship's outboard propellers. The prop shafts that are powered by this boiler room don't begin until over 100 feet aft of here. These boilers would heat the water into superheated steam, 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and push the steam aft into the next compartment and into the turbines at 815 pounds per square inch of pressure. This is the after engine room. We're currently 120 feet beneath the ship's second funnel, and this compartment houses 2 of the ship's 4 turbine engines, now quiet after a 17-year career of running smoothly and efficiently. Fans above would draw the heat and exhaust fumes up the shaft above and out the funnel. From here, it was like looking up into the inside of an enormous hollow skyscraper, seeing up 11 decks through the engine room ventilating shaft. We can even take a peek inside the turbines and see the blades. These turbines would spin at an incredible 4,300 rotations per minute, or 71 times a second. This rapid rotation is converted by double reduction gears aft of each turbine down to 160 RPM, which spin the ship's 2 inboard propellers for a 38-knot burst of speed.
Reduction gear. Turbine.
We can move aft another compartment, from the engine room into the after auxiliary machine room. We're right around C deck. On the opposite side of that bulkhead there is actually the swimming pool that we saw earlier. On the fantail, one of the ship's 5 propellers sits, sunning itself in the same spot that thousands of passengers once did. These massive 5-bladed propellers, when in service, each demanded 2 boilers, 1 turbine, a set of double reduction gears, and a propeller shaft. As the United States pressed forward through every sort of weather, at times the sea would crash over the ship's forecastle.
You see where they burnt off the connections?
This is how you got your Buick into the hole.
This area of the ship really took a beating during storms, but gave the crew a space to get fresh air on clearer days. While most of the ship's accommodations were stripped, there are some odd spaces that remain partially intact. The engine rooms, as we saw, were still mostly complete, aside from the asbestos installation and a few odds and ends that are removed. The entryway between the ballroom and the restaurant still shows the wall paneling and the ceiling. Deep below in the crew quarters, we were able to find some cabins and showers that were still mostly present. I guess it was too far into the ship to go for the auctioneers or the salvagers, so we uncovered what felt like a small time capsule. Yeah, some of the stuff was gone, but this is the closest we felt to the ship's service years. The SS United States held on to the Blue Riband through the sunset of the ocean liner age, with no challengers likely to take it on. But enter the challengers purely based on technicalities. This ship, by the company Virgin Atlantic, is literally named the Challenger. Obviously a much smaller craft and built as a speedboat, it did beat the SS United States' speed record across the Atlantic, but it didn't technically win the Blue Riband since it's not a commercial vessel. So the company instead made their own new trophy and gave it to themselves. Good job, guys. Then came along the cross-channel catamaran ferries built for service between Britain and France. Not content with the United States being the final holder of the Blue Riband, they challenged it and beat it at the speed record as well, just as Virgin's Challenger did. But here's the thing. Look at this ship, Hover Speed Great Britain, which beat the Big U's speed record. But look at the Big U. Really not the same thing at all. Hover Speed is not an ocean liner. It's not meant for transatlantic service, and it wasn't even carrying paying passengers when it beat the record. For all intents and purposes, it should really not have qualified, but because it would eventually carry passengers elsewhere, they were forced to hand over the Hales Trophy regardless to some cross-channel ferry. Most people who actually understand the meaning behind the Blue Riband and the Hales Trophy believe that the SS United States was cheated and is still the rightful holder of the record. The Conservancy to this day has been working to secure a future for America's flagship, most likely as a multi-purpose waterfront attraction. Like the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, the SS United States would make an excellent hotel, event space, and museum with plenty of ship left over for additional shopping, hospitality, and office purposes. As redevelopment plans for the vessel advance, the Conservancy is also committed to creating an extraordinary, interactive, dynamic, educational, and entertaining museum and visitor experience aboard the vessel that will explore and celebrate mid-century design, art, and innovation. The best way to support the Conservancy in their efforts is to visit their website at ssusc.org and consider a donation. The ship has outlasted her operators, the United States Lines, which liquidated in 1992. Nonetheless, for the first time since the ship was retired, the United States Lines house flag was flown from the ship's mast in 2014, after a replica was commissioned and donated to the Conservancy. I was on board to film it, along with SSUS Conservancy members Jordan Morris and Eric William Jones, two passionate enthusiasts who dedicated countless hours to the ship but have both since passed away.
We're very proud that just a couple days after her 62nd anniversary of the maiden voyage, we're able to raise the United States house flag on the ship for the first time in decades, probably for the first time since she was decommissioned.
The SS United States has loomed from the water since 1952. It has seen the hope and glory of its namesake country and also its sadness and defeat. She is still with us, steadfast and determined, a symbol of America at her peak. It is as if this ship is living out a purpose beyond her natural capacity. The strength to stand when it should fall, to endure when it should crumble, to trust when it should give up. And may we continuously strive to be like this old ship.
The SS United States was a technological marvel for the time. While many advancements in industry are born out of trial, error, and tragedy, few modern-day technological achievements are the result of the foresight, persistence, and tenacity of a single creative genius like Francis Gibbs, with a vision and a lifelong mission. The liner stands today as a uniquely tangible example of American problem-solving ability and command of industrial enterprise. Yes, it's still there. Yes, it's still remarkable. But it needs passion and revitalization in order to be saved.
I wanted to take a moment to thank the SS United States Conservancy for bringing my team on board and letting us film it and giving us a tour, including some of the more rare parts of the ship. My highest tier supporters on Patreon will be receiving luggage tags from first class with the letter D designation on it and a card on the out-of-service elevators. And also a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon.
Especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Trent Greger, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Tucker, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Nicholas Musella, Zolt Bognar, Colt Tannick, Sophie Baber, Jakob Martin Hansen, Rob, Oliver Chin Chen, Jahala, John Miluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, and